Thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to our Beyond 99% Uptime Building Truly Reliable EV Charging Networks webinar. I'm Sarah Woogen. I'm the VP of Product and Delivery for North America at the Mobility House. We're really excited to be joined today by Kameale Terry, the CEO of ChargerHelp, and Kyle Sears, our network specialist at the Mobility House. Today, we're going to explore how local and cloud networks work together, latest trends in charging reliability, and how architecture-dependent systems and metrics truly reflect the charger performance. Whether you're supporting school buses, transit fleets, commercial EV operations, today's session is designed to offer practical, vendor-agnostic guidance to keep your chargers connected and responsive. So with that, we're going to get started, and I'm going to pass it off to Kameale to talk a little bit first about some of the work they've been doing at ChargerHelp.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and to the Mobility House team. As mentioned, my name is Kameale. I'm the co-founder and CEO over here at ChargerHelp. I've been in the charging industry now for 10 years, and it has definitely been it's been an exciting place. We were just talking about this, how we were at the forefront of, innovation and yeah. So at ChargerHelp, we actually produce a report each year, and I have our 2025 report that I'll briefly go over that I believe will help ground some of the conversation we have here. And what I'm even more excited about is how we can continue to drive the conversation for 2026. So here we go. Okay. So one of the things that I started out with this at the top of this year, after a lot of the, announcements were coming out around legislation, was really looking at what does it take to continue to push forward charging reliability, maybe without federal support, and also really wanting to understand how did the general industry and also consumers were understanding charging reliability. Where were some of the things that we had actually accomplished and did really well in 2024 that we can get really excited about in 2025? The three things that that I was really pleased to hear was one, that we continue to see fleet operators continue to buy electric vehicle charging stations. We also started to see that there was an increase in uptime for EV charging reliability. And as you'll see in some of the report findings here, people's perception around reliability had actually changed, which was really neat. The data sources in the report, it's a coupling of our ChargerHelp data. At ChargerHelp, we fix EV charging stations, and we do it through people and technology. We also have over 26,000 assets that we've actually have touched and serviced. So it's looking at that data set. And then we also work with our data over at Parent Data. We took in some data also from Plug-in America. They had a public charging experience survey. We also took in more information around consumer survey because we really want to look at consumer perception. And we did some work around station aid and installation data as well. So I'm going to go through the first three findings here and then also our recommendations. So for folks that maybe haven't been in the industry for that long, charging reliability and uptime has really been an evolution, right? If you talk to folks 10 years ago when I first started in the industry, everyone would say, we have 100% uptime, everything works. Kameale, what are you talking about? And it took us a little bit of time to even get to a place where we're like, hey, we have a problem. And then once we admitted that we had a problem, then we were able to work with industry, from the EV Charging Association to folks like Flow, a whole heap of folks that came together and said, okay, let's come to an agreed upon way to understand uptime. And then from there, we had a legislation that came through, the California EV Charging Reliability Act. So there has been a natural, really good progression of the industry in and of itself unpacking this problem, and being able to, I believe, get to a better place. So the first finding that we found was that uptime actually improved, right? Like that was the really neat part. Like as an industry, we identified that we had a problem, we came up with a formula, and we worked towards it in order to improve it. But what we also found out this year as well is that we started to see that there isn't necessarily a huge correlation between uptime and the station actually working as intended. Why that is. Charging infrastructure these are software enabled assets. And so what we saw was that there was this new emerging signal or measurement that came out of the joint office that we should start looking at, and that was charge start success rate. So while we saw that there was, 71% of attempts were successful, you still saw that 30% of attempts were unsuccessful, even when the station was considered to be up. The recommendation that I'll talk briefly about, but we're going to go more into in our conversation, is really around this idea that charging infrastructure are IoT devices. These are smart assets. As mankind, this is our first time really bringing software into the built environment. And so when you do that, we will have to continue to measure differently, right? And so I think it's really setting us up to say, yes, uptime is one, charge start success rate is another, but we will continue to have to look at this experience to come up with new measurements. And so really we're pushing the industry to adopt more reliability metrics, not just uptime. And it goes to what the mobility house before today is beyond 99%. How do we actually get to the asset operating as intended? The second finding that we had was I thought was quite interesting because honestly, y'all, perception is everything. Like I can tell you that things are getting a lot better, but if you as a consumer continue to believe that everything is broken, that really matters, right? And what we did see from a perception perspective, when we looked at the EV driver perception, we actually saw that number one issue impacting EV adoption from the driver's perception was actually charging speed and not reliability. Reliability had actually slipped down to number three, which I think is good. And it also shows that there is an opportunity for these first two that are impacting EV adoption to really be around, I believe, like consumer education, and really creating more consumer friendly interfaces for folks that are working with public charging. So our recommendation there is really like, how do you build driver trust and confidence through clear communication, simple tools, and user-centered design? I'm gonna move into three because I'm really excited about our conversation today. The third one, it's always been kind of like the thing that I've been a little bit frustrated by. In our industry, we were seeing this where folks after maybe 3 or 4 years were just, when they were seeing that there was reliability issues, swapping out things such as DC fast chargers. And if you bought a DC fast charger before, you know it's very expensive. And to simply swap it out because you think that there's a reliability issue actually to me defeats the purpose of trying to figure out what's actually wrong. And so we saw that hardware swaps just deliver temporary gains. And for folks that maybe you're new to this industry or you're looking at procuring assets yourself, what we're going to talk about today is really going to help you become a more educated buyer. So that way you're not in a situation where you're just having to swap a unit, where these are actually solvable problems that we believe at ChargerHelp can actually be solved either through the technology partner you choose, maybe like a mobility house, or even down to the RFP requirements. But we essentially found that assets after being swapped still experience issues up to 3 years later, and they had to do more with software and operability issues than anything else. So our recommendation here, we really believe that we want to facilitate a big tent big tent entity for charging. Like I said before, charging infrastructure, these are IoT assets. And not only are these IoT assets, these are IoT assets that we are publicly deploying on highways and byways in ways that we've never done it before. And so I think that it's important for us to understand both software and the built environment, but also all the players that have to be able to work seamlessly in order to have a good charge start success rate. And so we're going to get more into this later, but really, I think the biggest takeaway that I got from this one is that the industry is willing and ready to address these issues. Two, the issues that we're experiencing will not just be for charging infrastructure. This is what happens when you bring software into the built environment problem. And so we should utilize the charging space in order for us to further understand how do we want to do that well. And three, as folks who are purchasing assets, it's hugely important that you do become educated, you do become aware, or choosing partners that are having the right conversations, which is essentially what we're going to be talking about today, which is what happens when you go past the 99% uptime and you focus truly on the experience of that driver. Sarah, thank you so much. Excited for the conversation. I'll pass it back over to you and I will unshare my screen.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Camille. Really a lot of great insights and a lot I'm very excited to unpack later. Before we jump into any kind of questions, I wanted to hand off to Kyle and let him talk a little bit about local architecture and local connections and how all of that really plays into reliability.
Hey, so yeah, as Camille had said, chargers are IoT infrastructure, right? They are talking and communicating with something else. They're providing information. They're getting commands from other things. So another a thing that is often overlooked in these charging systems is the actual networking, the how they are going to be accomplishing this communications. Um, we take the view that this is a very important bit of critical information being passed here. So we like to keep that information, keep that communication happening locally, in a network that you control on a set of equipment that you can get your hands on. By doing it this way, it really reduces the latency, the physical and logical distance between charger and controller. And it kind of reduces the amount of ways this can fail. Um, Keeping it on a land that you control, you're taking a lot of the internet bits and bobs out of it, and you're not relying on that cloud anymore. You have got everything local to you. Charge Pilot brings the local controller, installs it into your facility, and it itself does not rely on the cloud quite as much as other systems might. It keeps all of that communication local to your facility.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I just want to jump into questions here and start. So, Camille, you talked a lot about uptime in your report. You also talked a lot about successful charge rate. And as you know, us at the Mobility House, we focus in the fleet space and we have similar but slightly different reliability conversations. And we're hearing things about how while uptime is very relevant for public charging, we're hearing successful charge rate in Europe by a lot of leaders over there, as well as in your report. So I'm wondering, Camille, can you talk a little bit about your view on those different measurements and what is kind of the best measurement or why some the pros and cons of each of those different types of measurements?
Sure. So, I always start things as a consumer. So if I'm purchasing something, right, what is my expectation? My expectation, right, is that whatever I'm purchasing will work. And for us in charging, that is that can the electron travel to the vehicle as intended, like as simply put. And so what we've been trying to do is like, how can you measure that? I think early on, we thought as an industry that uptime was the way that you measured that by having heartbeats or a station pinging a cloud, to Kyle's point earlier, essentially determined that the station would work. We quickly found out that that was not true. And this is why, entities such as like ChargerHelp are very important, because even though these assets, yes, are smart enabled assets, you still require people to validate. And one of the things that we saw early on is that a lot of folks will have, labs and where they're testing these things in the labs. And so they're making assumptions off of what's happening in the lab, but then they're never getting any type of data feedback loop from the field to see if their assumptions was true. And so Sarah, like really like what we try to say is like, okay, we know where we want to get to, and we're consistently essentially a little bit pessimistic on when if we got there or not, right? So we're always asking, is this true? Is this the right measurement? Can I validate that with data from the field? And so that's how we think about it. So uptime was one way to do that. We thought we were going to be able to determine that through the correlation of heartbeats to electrons getting to the vehicle. From field service data, we quickly identified that that was not true. It is not always true. So next we went to charge start success rate. We said, okay, if an electron is all, does charge start success rate always tells me if an electron is getting to the vehicle. I think that for right now, it's a good measurement. But what we're really looking at, which takes it a step further, is the electron getting to the vehicle every single instance that an attempt is made on the first attempt. And so I think for us, we have a unique perspective, and we like to join in with customer, partners such as yourselves, because you allow space to say that we need help with understanding if we're there yet, right? So I think, Sarah, it's kind of like, to wrap it up, it's like we know what our end state is, and we're always a little bit pessimistic on if we're there yet, and we're always trying to validate it and get closer and closer and closer to the right metric, because this is a new deployment. And for folks that maybe you are just now deploying this type of asset, the best advice I can give you is to include your IT department and your infrastructure people when you're looking at deploying this asset, because this is not just an infrastructure asset, this is a software enabled asset, and it requires a little bit more thought than I think that as a global entity, I think than what we thought, right?
That's great. Yeah, and great pivot into a question I have here for Kyle. I mean, Kameale, you mentioned how a lot of these things are tested in a very controlled lab environment, right? And that's how, these charger uptime numbers are being tested. And we see the same thing in the connection between the charger and the CMS. It's in a controlled lab environment. Even if it's a cloud CMS, you're controlling exactly your signal strength you have at any time. So Kyle, would love to hear a little bit from you on, what the pros and cons are of local architecture, such as what we have at the Mobility House versus that more cloud when you're actually in the field and outside of that lab environment.
Well, again, one of the benefits of keeping this critical communication in a network that you control is you can more closely set it up in a way that resembles the lab setup. There's a lot of uncontrollable factors that come up once you get past your firewall and you start trying to communicate with the cloud. You're at the will of the internet provider, the cloud provider. Um, Wireless networks that are prone to just environmental factors. So by keeping all of the communications in the LAN, it really is going to better resemble your lab environment, but at the same time, it just is going to provide you a much more secure connection at the end of the day. Overall, we have much more success that way.
And, kind of building on that a little bit, besides the connection, can you talk a little bit about the round trip response times between a cloud-based CMS and something with a
Yeah.
local controller and optimization like ChargePilot?
So on your LAN, in a typical Charge Pilot setup, for instance, we have a very simple setup. So we are looking at very, very short round trip times between charger and charge controller. Um, you know, Sub 10 milliseconds. But once you start factoring in communications with the cloud, that is going to increase by a factor of depending on what uplink method you're using. So you can start seeing 50 millisecond, 100 millisecond. In a really bad condition, maybe you're getting close to seconds worth of round trip time, all depending on what uplink you're using. And again, that's something that you're just kind of forced to accept. You don't have that control anymore. You're just really at the will of a provider. So overall, makes it a little bit more tricky to plan for. And it's not really something that can be accounted for all of the time. It's going to be a very dynamic situation. LAN makes it a little bit more predictable.
Great. And question for both of you guys, from a user experience and charging performance perspective, how does that unpredictability impact those experiences and effectiveness?
Yeah, we see this. One of the things I always tell folks, one of the things you do to ensure reliability is to hardwire the station, right? So we've seen this happen in instances where we'll have charging infrastructure deployed in a certain area. It's having great uptime, everything's fine, good charge start success rate, and then you'll immediately start to see issues. What we always check for first is if there was any new construction in the area. So you think about your cell phone, right? If you're in an area that then start has a whole bunch of buildings that are going up, and we're seeing this in some cities that we've seen over the last 10 years have had a lot of new construction, and then all of a sudden now that asset that is trying to rely on cellular connectivity to get to the cloud now has intermediate cell signal. So that's one thing that has been very challenging because a lot of these assets are operating sometimes off of just T-Mobile or just Verizon, or, I know a lot of people have these SIM cards that are like bouncing around now, but you do automatically put into your system a failure point that can be impacted literally by new architecture in a certain area. Well, we'll study like statuses and things like this. And so you'll get into these places where statuses are going blank. So it typically means that the station isn't properly able to communicate what's going on with it. And then you'll start correlating it maybe to high foot traffic. We've seen this with a hospital before. During time periods of like a lot of folks at the hospital, a lot of things going on, you start to see drop off in statuses or statuses that are blank because the station can no longer communicate that to the cloud, right? So cellular connectivity, which goes back to these being not only IoT assets that are in your home, but now IoT assets that are in a public landscape where you don't have a lot of cities that have Wi-Fi or good cellular connectivity, you're automatically introducing failure points into your system.
Exactly that. Packet loss is a really big contributing factor to failed charge sessions. You know, the heartbeats might be making it through. So yes, your charger does look like it's online, but when a command is sent, if it doesn't make it because it was dropped in the process, again, by a cell being overloaded, it's really going to affect that, first plug ability. It's going to reduce that user experience very quickly.
Absolutely. And those are the things, just like to piggyback off of that, like when we start seeing like repair times and downtime and who takes care of what, that's something that if you're experiencing that, technically is not underneath your hardware warranty. Technically, can you really prove that the software provider did something wrong? And then if you're continuing to experience that, then you get into a situation where you don't have anyone that's going to be able to help you, right? And that was one of the reasons why we started ChargerHelp, because we knew that there's a way for companies to like build better products, like clearly you guys are doing at the mobility house, but there are also these instances where it's hard to determine whose fault is it, and you don't send an electrician to go and diagnose that, right? Like, what is the electrician going to do? So it just goes into, again, like as you're thinking about procuring these assets, you do have to take a different mind frame to really understanding the asset to properly, put together proper RFPs to make sure that you're going to get something that's going to work.
And speaking from a technical point of view, there's nothing that a tech support or even a user hates more is an intermittent problem,
Yeah.
one that is not easily recreated. You always get to that troubleshooting call, and well, the problem's not here right now. We
Right.
have to wait until later, and you don't get a lot of success in situations like that.
Yeah.
Going back to some questions, Kameale, for you, you talked a little bit about certifications and standards. You had OCPP certification in your slides. We at the Mobility House just received our certification from OCA for OCPP 2.01. And, we're finding that it's pretty bare. It certifies things like security and core, but it's not certifying smart charging profiles. It's not certifying anything related to error codes and things that are really needed for reliability. So, wanted to get your view on that and what you guys at ChargerHelp are advocating for when it comes to these types of standards.
Yeah, for us, we believe you have to start somewhere. We think that what is the opposite of not having anything, it can create a bit of chaos. And so, I mean, but to your point, I think that what we've seen specifically in the US market is how we've deployed and how fragmented our market is does require us to have for us to have something a little bit different or taking a step further past just the OCPP certification. And so for folks that may not know, the Open Charge Alliance is the organization that came up with the with OCPP. OCPP is the communication method for the charging infrastructure. And interestingly enough, we're one of the only countries that we do not have like a subsidiary of someone from America representing us that is in America from OCA, right? And so it's an international body. And I think the rest of the countries do charging a little bit differently. And so because of that, what we need for America, I think that it is lacking a bit from what OCA is requiring. I think the rub is it the role of the Open Charge Alliance to create something specialized for America, right? The rub is, because we have very we have a very fragmented industry. Um, is it the role of OCA to do that for us, right? If other folks are doing well with, uptime, and for whatever reason we don't do well here, where does that then lie? And so I think, Sarah, like, my point here is that our stance is that at bare minimum, we at least need to start from the same place. So we do highly, push for folks to be certified, right? We that's very important to us. And right, we do also push for folks to really look at the work that was done through the joint office, through the ChargeX consortium around error codes, and to implement that. There still is a gap around error codes specifically that I think will continue to really result in us not being able to know what to do when something is going on. I know that the Charin group is really looking at that, and so we're really trying to, one, put forth reports like the reliability report, align ourselves with organizations like yourselves that are thinking about this a little bit differently, and trying to identify what is that association that's going to help the American market become more reliable. The last thing I'll say to this, is that I think that, and we're kind of seeing this now, we're at a place now where there isn't a ton of federal funding. And so things will come down to business cases and what makes sense. And will somebody buy something that they know inherently does not work? And so then you might just have, the markets play here, and you might have a lot of companies either consolidating or dying out. And so that's kind of like, that's our stance right now. Is like, we think there has to be a bare minimum. I do think there needs to be something for America. I don't know if that's OCA's job. I do believe that the market will right size itself by companies that are not thinking about this, and prioritizing it, as they should be.
Great. And so, we're seeing different jurisdictions, certain states, California, New York, for example, require certification to do any charging projects that are funded by any of those state funds. It sounds like maybe you're saying that that's not enough, and the individual companies need to take on the responsibility of making sure things are thorough and standardized, and not so much these different jurisdictions and different standard bodies.
I mean, I'm actually, I guess, like, what I say is I'm interested in, like, working with the folks that are procuring these assets for them to understand what they're procuring and have them control what is required, right? Like, I think that you can create laws all day, but if the buyer is not informed, the buyer will continue to buy poor products and being upset. And that doesn't help our industry if they're buying products that we ourselves will be like, I would not buy that. Like, 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 no, why are you doing that? So I'm more so of the mindset of, like, how do we continue to educate the buyer, bring departments together? And I continue to hear this with a lot of large organizations when they're like, yeah, when we go out to RFP, we're only consulting our infrastructure people. I never talk to IT. And there's a lot of things that are required for charging that if you were going through the IT side of the procurement side, you actually would have to do, whether that's firmware release updates, whether that's being able to fall back on a prior firmware. There's a whole bunch of things that IT departments are usually requiring of IT that is not required of charging. And so that's really, I start with where the purse is. And this is somebody who helped write a law, but I think they're good. Laws are good, but really it's going to require, it's like, you got to educate your buyer. And I think once you educate the buyer will make good decisions. Mostly, I believe that. Yes.
Great. Yeah, I agree. So one more question, kind of totally different direction here for Kyle, and then we're going to jump into some of the questions that have come through in the chat and the Q&A. Kyle, what's the worst case scenario where that a network failure can have on a charging system safety?
Oh, well, as far as safety concerned, the whole point of this charging system is to make sure there is a maintainable and safe load on your electrical system at the facility, right? So if we're talking worst case scenarios here, if we start dropping packets, we're not getting successful meter updates maybe from our main panel, um, and the chargers don't shed load suddenly when there's a demand spike within our facility. Um, the local controller is going to tell the chargers to, slow down. We need to compensate for something else. And chargers don't get this message, and suddenly our electrical system is overloaded. The panel is beyond its max and fire. It has happened before in systems. This is what we're trying to avoid.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a perfect pivot into the first audience question we've got here. So, you've mentioned packet loss a few times. Can you share a little bit more about that? What does packet loss mean in the context of a charging system?
So packet loss in the networking sense, when devices are communicating, they're sending packets to each other. So packet loss is a percentage of overall packets that you've sent, and the other side has heard. So ideally, best world scenario, 0% packet loss. That means everything is making it through. But when you get an unreliable connection, maybe it's a bad Wi-Fi signal or a bad cellular connection, maybe there's just a lot of hops in between, packets will start to get lost. And the more packets you lose, the more the conversation is missing. Uh, Chargers speak OCPP, which is a TCP protocol. So yes, these packets are going to be resent, but maybe the contents of that message aren't relevant anymore because it took so long for the information to make it through. So it really reinforces the importance of getting it through the first time. There's a lot of meter consumption updates that are being sent through, and they're really measuring this real-time information, and they need this real-time information so that the whole system as a whole remains safe, and balanced.
Great, thank you. And just want to piggyback on that and clarify for everyone, like these types of scenarios of safety, like fires that we're talking about, that's things that become a risk when you can have high packet loss. And as Kyle just said, that high packet loss comes with cloud systems, comes with wireless connections. And so yeah, so that's why having that local optimization is really important
Sure.
to almost eliminate that risk. Great. I'm going to jump to the next question here. Question on whether you can have redundancy in communication in both hardwired Ethernet connection and cellular communications, or whether it's one or the other.
It's really going to depend on the hardware, and this goes back to like that kind of like making sure you understand what you're procuring. So some hardware, which is so interesting, they're either only Wi-Fi, only cellular, or only LAN. And there's difference in pricing between all three of those, the hardwire itself. And if you ever get to a place where you get one that is cellular and now you want to hardwire it, you may have to swap out that whole physical unit and they will charge you for it. So I think the first step is really understanding, do you have a hardware manufacturer that can do both? And my last kind of like thought on it is, if I'm going to hardwire a station, I don't feel like I would need to have a cellular connection. So I wouldn't really know like what the purpose is. I wouldn't do cellular first and then revert back to hardware. If you're going to pay to hardwire, I would just hardwire. And that's kind of like the biggest piece to this is why people typically don't hardwire stations is because they are typically a little bit more expensive. And it could be something that needs to be done during installation as well. But that's my viewpoint on it. But sure, Kyle, you guys have some thoughts as well.
I agree. Ethernet connection, in my eyes, is just one of the best ways. It's easiest way to help guarantee a low packet loss situation.
Yeah.
They don't generally fall out of an Ethernet cable quite like they do in wireless.
Yeah. And I would say like the thing that I always tell people is like you either pay for it now or you're gonna pay for it later. So you're either gonna pay for, to go ahead and do it the right way now, or you're gonna consistently have issues at your charging station for whatever reason. So it's really looking at, okay, how do I create a more resilient system, especially if you're doing fleets? Like don't skip the step, don't try to save a dollar here. It's just not worth it.
Absolutely.
Great. Before we jump to the final question in the chat, I wanted to just once again remind everyone, if you have any last questions before we wrap up here, please throw them in so we can get to them. I'm gonna now jump to our final question here. So, for fleet operations that are running a mix of different hardwares across multiple implementations, what architectural decisions best guarantee reliable, low latency control, especially when balancing local fallback logic with cloud-based optimization?
Oh man. Okay. Oh, I can go first, Kyle, or let me.
You can
Yeah,
open. I'll
okay.
come in behind.
Okay, so we're seeing this happen a lot right now. I think the best way you can control is having the same RFP requirements that are focused on reliability. So we put out a buyer's report alongside the Open Charge Alliance and Alliance for Transportation Electrification earlier this year, which you can find. We can send it out. But in there, there's about like five core things that you should require. Period. So some of the things that are it's very important is understanding the error codes across all of those machines and that they're all the same. What we often see sometimes is every manufacturer has drastically different error codes. And so when you come to creating something that is more reliable, you might even be stuck with not even understanding what's going on with the charging station. The other thing that's hugely important is also firmware. I would just put, I think like like a bucket firmware. Underneath firmware, I think the first thing is having release notes and requiring that all of your manufacturers have release notes that they're sending out to you before it's pushed. Best case scenario, they allow you to make a decision on when you're pushing firmware, but you could have multiple manufacturers pushing firmwares differently at different times that can actually interject a whole heap of problems all at once. And then the last piece is fallback features, right? So we have some entities that you can't actually roll back the firmware to something else. So whatever problem you done rolled out, you're stuck there. So that's where I get to like, there's just like fundamental things from a software hygiene perspective that could help protect you if you have multiple manufacturers and multiple software providers. But what usually happens is that a lot of the procurement RFPs that I see are not that nuanced and doesn't go deep enough in order to require a level of consistency in the industry. And you think that you're going to get it because both of these folks have CMS softwares, or you think you're going to get it because both these folks are DC fast chargers. It's not true. It's just not true. So that's my little tidbit.
Yeah, and one of the best ways, in my point of view, a common networking across all vendors really helps out as well. Again, just go with a wired connection, if possible. It's just really going to make yourself a little bit more future proof, um, as well as local optimization really does make a big difference here. You're if you can do all of that optimization local to the plant, then suddenly you're not relying on the cloud for that optimization. You're not subject to cloud outages anymore. You are able to continue on in the event of an internet outage, just as you were before. So really keeping everything local is definitely going to help quite a bit.
Mhm.
And just to dive into that a little bit deeper, can you talk a little bit about the difference between local optimization, as you're referring to, and a cloud-based optimization that has a local controller backup?
Yeah, so cloud-based optimization is going to involve all of the chargers relaying all of the command and control information right all the way to the cloud. So it's no longer in your network anymore. It is all being shipped off. The optimization, the load management functions are all going to happen up in the cloud, and then the commands are going to come back down. So there's a lot of distance that has to be traversed right there. Where a local optimization, you're going to take a local controller, you're going to install it within your facility. Chargers are going to directly communicate with that local controller. Um, Everything will happen again locally. That's the best part of it all. But by having that optimization, that charge management happening locally, it still might interface with the cloud a little bit, but in essence, it is able to function without the internet. So your facility, your network is just going to be one step above the rest when it comes to that security, that ability to function, you know, when the cloud falls down.
Great. Thank you. Well, I want to thank you both for your time and thank you everyone in the audience for joining us today and participating with your questions. Before we close out here, just want to pass it off to each of you. If there's any closing thoughts you want to add, and also if you could just let people know how they can get in touch with you if they want to continue the conversation. So, Kameale, we'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, the thing that I hope, if you're in the industry, my push to you is to really just start to look at how does your organization play into first attempt success? What are things that you can be doing at your organization, whether it's sharing data, getting data organized so it can be shared, having an open API. What is your portion that can help with achieving first attempt success? And I think as an industry, we really, really have to focus on that in January. We can no longer state, well, like we did everything right, it's the hardware manufacturer, or we did everything right, it's the payment systems, we did everything right, it's the vehicle. We have to get away from that. We have to say, okay, sure, I'm doing everything right, but what else can I lend, give, whatever have you to ensure that my partner is also doing all the things right? I think that's the first if you're in industry. If you are looking to deploy charging infrastructure, my push to you is to really, just like you understand every other asset, seek to understand this asset class. Ask questions. There's a lot of work that was done through the ChargeX consortium around proper KPIs for this industry. The Alliance for Transportation Electrification is a great organization to be a part of. This can work and be very successful, but just like everything else that you procure, you have to do your due diligence and check but verify, trust but verify. So those would be my two things I would leave with you all. And because I have a marketing department and I do have a company, I have to talk about ChargerHelp. So at ChargerHelp, we're really, really, really invested in reliability as a service. As you can see, I am personally passionate about reliability and the success of this industry, but I also have an amazing company that is doing great work of not only ensuring reliability, but smoothing out some of those edges when maybe some of the folks in your ecosystem aren't ready, right? We're able to do that, and we work with tremendous partners, and we choose good partners as well, like the Mobility House. We do not work with everyone. I tell people I don't work with everyone. We work with people that are prioritizing reliability and is really taking the success of this industry very seriously. But that's what I would say, Sarah.
Great, thank you. Kyle, any closing thoughts? Let us know if people can get in touch with you if they want to continue the conversation.
Um, do not be afraid to bring your IT departments into these projects. Do get their input. Every organization is going to have different requirements, and the IT department is really going to be able to help you plan for success here. I am available over LinkedIn if anybody has any questions, or by email, uh, kyle.sears@mobilityhouse.com. So if anybody has any follow-up questions after this, feel free.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. We hope you guys have a great rest of your day and rest of your week.
Yeah.